Today's global analysis is focusing on a development that many observers are now calling a turning point in modern geopolitics. Experts suggest that once this pattern is clearly understood, ongoing global events, including tensions surrounding Iran, the weakening of the US dollar, and increasing political instability inside the United States, begin to form a clear and connected picture rather than appearing as isolated incidents. According to this analysis, what is unfolding is not random. Instead, it reflects a historical pattern that has repeated itself over thousands of years. Analysts argue that the United States may now be following the same pattern with remarkable precision. To understand this framework, attention is being drawn to the work of a relatively lesser-known but highly influential historian, Sir John Glubb. A British general and scholar, Glubb dedicated much of his career to studying the rise and fall of major global empires. His research covered civilizations including the Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Mongols, Ottomans, Spanish, and British empires. In his widely discussed work, The Fate of Empires, Glubb presented a striking conclusion. He argued that all major empires, without exception, passed through a predictable sequence of stages. Most notably, he observed that the average lifespan of a dominant empire is approximately 250 years. This figure is now gaining renewed attention as the United States approaches that same historical time frame. Stage 1, the Age of Conquest. According to this framework, every empire begins with what is described as the Age of Conquest. This phase is defined by discipline, expansion, and strong collective purpose. At this stage, there is minimal corruption and maximum focus, as wealth has not yet accumulated to create internal weaknesses. For the United States, this phase is often associated with the period from its independence in 1776 through the end of World War II. During this time, the country expanded territorially, developed a powerful industrial base, and ultimately emerged victorious in a global conflict fought across multiple fronts. Observers highlight that this era was marked by sacrifice and unity. Massive industrial production, widespread mobilization, and significant social contributions, including women entering the workforce, contributed to what many describe as an unprecedented level of national effort. Following the war, the United States not only emerged victorious, but also played a central role in rebuilding former adversaries. Through initiatives such as post-war economic programs and the establishment of global financial systems, the U.S. positioned itself as the leading global power. Stage 2, the Age of Commerce. Following military dominance, the next stage is identified as the Age of Commerce. During this period, economic power becomes the central force, with trade expansion driving national prosperity. For the United States, this stage is commonly associated with the 1950s and 1960s. During this time, economic growth surged, and the middle class expanded significantly. Analysts often point out that this period represented one of the highest standards of living in modern history. Industrial output reached record levels, and the US dollar became a dominant global currency. Technological advancements, including major achievements in space exploration, further reinforced the country's global leadership. However, experts emphasize that this stage, while highly successful, is historically temporary. Stage 3, the Age of Affluence. The third phase, known as the Age of Affluence, is where structural challenges begin to emerge. According to historical analysis, increasing wealth leads to comfort, and comfort gradually reduces discipline and long-term strategic focus. During this period, societies often develop a belief that their dominance is permanent. This mindset can lead to reduced urgency in addressing emerging risks. In the United States, analysts identify this phase beginning in the post-1960s period. One of the most significant developments during this time was the expansion of the military-industrial system. Despite the end of large-scale global conflict, military spending remained consistently high. Warnings about this shift were raised early. Concerns were expressed that a permanent defense system combined with industrial interests could begin to influence national decision-making. Over time, critics argue that military strategy and economic incentives became increasingly interconnected. Conflicts such as the Vietnam War are frequently cited as examples of this phase. Significant financial and human resources were invested, yet long-term strategic outcomes remained unclear. Observers note that despite such outcomes, accountability remained limited. At the same time, major economic changes began to take place. Manufacturing production gradually shifted overseas, while financial markets gained increasing importance. This transition contributed to a long-term stagnation in wages for many workers. even as overall economic output continued to grow. Experts highlight that real wage growth for average workers began to slow significantly during this period, marking a shift in economic distribution. Stage 4, the age of decadence, the fourth stage, often described as the most critical, is referred to as the age of decadence. In this context, decadence does not refer to morality, but rather to systemic imbalance within the structure of power. According to analysis, several key developments occur simultaneously during this stage. First, there is a growing disconnect between military spending and actual outcomes. Despite record levels of defense expenditure, achieving clear strategic victories becomes increasingly difficult. This raises questions about efficiency and long-term sustainability. Second, national debt begins to expand rapidly. Current figures indicate that the United States is managing a debt level that continues to increase annually, with significant resources being allocated solely to interest payments. Experts describe this as a potential structural challenge, as rising debt can create long-term financial pressure and limit future policy flexibility. Third, the role of the national currency evolves. The US dollar, which has long been central to global trade, has been used as a tool in international policy decisions. However, analysts suggest that this approach may also encourage other countries to develop alternative financial systems. As a result, discussions around diversification, alternative currencies, and new trade mechanisms have increased in recent years. Finally, internal social dynamics also shift. Economic inequality, infrastructure concerns, and political divisions are frequently cited as indicators of deeper structural change within society. Observers emphasize that these factors do not operate independently. Instead, they reinforce one another, creating a complex and interconnected set of challenges. As this analysis continues, experts are now turning their attention to the deeper structural pressures shaping the current global landscape. According to the same historical framework, the fourth stage, often described as the most fragile phase of any empire, is defined not by a single crisis, but by multiple pressures emerging at the same time. Observers emphasize that these pressures are interconnected, reinforcing each other in ways that make reversal increasingly difficult. One of the central concerns highlighted is the growing imbalance between military expenditure and measurable outcomes. Current estimates suggest that the United States allocates significantly more resources to defense than any other nation. However, analysts argue that the effectiveness of this spending is being questioned in several recent conflicts. Examples frequently cited include prolonged military engagements where objectives remained unclear or outcomes did not match expectations. This has led to a broader debate about efficiency, long-term strategy, and whether financial investment alone can guarantee strategic success. At the same time, attention is also focused on the structure of decision-making. Experts suggest that in this stage, institutional systems can become self-reinforcing. This means policies continue not necessarily because they are producing results, but because they sustain existing structures and interests. Closely linked to this issue is the question of national debt. Financial data indicates that debt levels have reached historically high levels, with annual increases continuing at a steady pace. A significant portion of national spending is now directed towards servicing existing debt rather than reducing it. Economists describe this as a potential debt cycle, where new borrowing is required to manage existing obligations. Over time, this cycle can become increasingly difficult to control, especially if economic growth does not keep pace. Analysts note that this situation creates limited options. Governments may either attempt to manage debt through inflation, which reduces purchasing power, or through strict financial adjustments, which can slow economic activity. Both approaches carry risks and potential long-term consequences. Another major development being closely monitored is the evolving role of the US dollar in the global system. For decades, the dollar has functioned as the primary reserve currency, enabling international trade and financial stability. However, recent policy decisions, including the use of financial restrictions and sanctions, have led some countries to reconsider their reliance on the dollar. As a result, alternative systems are gradually being explored. Economic groups and regional alliances are now working on new payment structures that allow trade to occur without direct dependence on a single currency. Additionally, central banks in several countries have increased their gold reserves and diversified their financial strategies. Experts stress that these changes are not happening suddenly, but rather gradually. However, once such transitions begin, They can accelerate over time as more participants adopt alternative systems. At the domestic level, social and economic indicators are also drawing increased attention. Reports highlight rising inequality, with wealth distribution becoming more concentrated over time. While overall economic output remains high, the benefits are not evenly distributed across all segments of society. In parallel, challenges related to infrastructure, public services, and long-term investment have been identified. These factors contribute to broader discussions about sustainability and long-term economic resilience. Political analysts also point to increasing polarization within society. Differences in opinion, trust in institutions, and public confidence in governance structures have all become key areas of concern. Experts note that internal divisions can amplify external challenges. When resources are required to address both domestic and international pressures simultaneously, strategic flexibility becomes more limited. Historical comparisons are often used to illustrate this point. Analysts reference past empires that faced similar conditions. External competition combined with internal fragmentation, leading to gradual decline rather than sudden collapse. One key concept frequently mentioned in this context is derived from game theory, particularly the idea that individually rational decisions can collectively lead to negative outcomes. In simple terms, each group within a system may act in its own best interest. However, when all groups follow this logic simultaneously, the overall system may become unstable. For example, industries may prioritize profit, political actors may focus on electoral success, and institutions may aim to preserve influence. While each decision may be rational on its own, the combined effect can create long-term structural challenges. Analysts emphasize that this dynamic makes reform particularly difficult. Those who benefit from the existing system often have limited incentive to change it, even if broader risks are recognized. As a result, adjustments tend to occur slowly, often in response to external pressures rather than internal planning. This leads to the next phase in the historical framework, a stage described as transition, or in some cases, collapse. Experts clarify that collapse does not necessarily mean sudden disappearance. Instead, it typically unfolds over time through a series of connected developments. Three major shifts are commonly identified during this phase. First is the possibility of a currency transition. If a dominant currency loses its central role, global trade patterns may adjust accordingly. This can lead to changes in import costs, inflation levels, and overall economic stability. Second is a shift in alliances. Countries that once relied on a dominant power for security or economic support may begin to diversify their partnerships. This does not happen instantly, but gradually as new relationships are formed. Third is internal political restructuring. As pressure increases, existing systems may face challenges in maintaining stability. Public confidence can decline, leading to changes in leadership, policy direction, or institutional frameworks. Experts highlight that these developments do not require coordination. Instead, they emerge naturally when underlying conditions reach a certain point. Historical examples suggest that such transitions can occur within relatively short timeframes once key thresholds are crossed. As the analysis returns to the present, observers note that several of these conditions appear to be developing simultaneously. Ongoing geopolitical tensions, economic adjustments, and evolving global partnerships are all contributing to a period of uncertainty. However, experts caution against viewing this solely in negative terms. They emphasize that periods of transition also create opportunities for restructuring and adaptation. The key question, according to analysts, is not whether change will occur, but how it will unfold and which systems will emerge stronger as a result. Understanding these patterns, they argue, is essential for interpreting current events and anticipating future developments. As the situation continues to unfold, analysts are now closely examining how present-day developments align with historical transition patterns. According to the same framework, once an empire enters the late stage of systemic pressure, multiple accelerating factors begin to shape the timeline toward the next phase. Experts argue that what makes the current moment particularly significant is not any single crisis, but the convergence of several major pressures happening at the same time. One of the most closely watched elements is the impact of ongoing geopolitical tensions, particularly in relation to Iran. Analysts note that prolonged conflict scenarios tend to place sustained pressure on financial resources, military logistics, and political stability. Current assessments suggest that extended military engagement, especially without a clearly defined long-term outcome, can gradually weaken strategic positioning. Each additional phase of involvement increases operational costs while also testing public and political support. Observers highlight that modern warfare is not only fought on the battlefield, but also through economic endurance. Maintaining prolonged engagement requires consistent funding, technological deployment, and international coordination, all of which become more complex over time. In parallel, financial experts continue to monitor the trajectory of national debt. As previously noted, rising debt levels combined with ongoing expenditures create a situation where financial flexibility becomes increasingly limited. Economic analysts explain that when debt reaches a certain threshold, it begins to influence broader policy decisions. Governments may find themselves prioritizing short-term stability over long-term reform, particularly when immediate pressures demand continuous funding. This creates a cycle in which financial commitments expand while structural adjustments are delayed. At the same time, global monetary dynamics are undergoing gradual transformation. The role of the US dollar, while still dominant, is facing incremental challenges as alternative systems gain attention. Several countries have already initiated steps toward diversifying their trade and financial mechanisms. These include conducting bilateral trade in local currencies, increasing gold reserves, and developing independent payment networks. Experts emphasize that such changes are not isolated decisions, but part of a broader trend. As more countries adopt similar approaches, the overall structure of global finance may begin to shift. This process is often described as gradual, but potentially irreversible once it reaches a critical level of participation. Another key factor being discussed is the concept of strategic time advantage. In prolonged global situations, the question is not only about immediate outcomes, but about which side can sustain pressure for a longer period. Analysts suggest that endurance, economic, political, and social, becomes a decisive factor. Countries with diversified systems, alternative supply routes, and internal resilience may be better positioned to absorb long-term challenges. Conversely, systems that are already under internal pressure may find it more difficult to maintain stability over extended periods. Domestic conditions therefore play a critical role in shaping external outcomes. Reports continue to highlight ongoing challenges related to economic inequality, public infrastructure, and social cohesion. Experts note that these internal factors influence not only economic performance, but also national decision-making. When internal divisions increase, the ability to respond effectively to external challenges can be reduced. Political dynamics are also evolving in response to these pressures. Analysts point to growing polarization and shifts in public sentiment as indicators of deeper structural change. In such environments, policy decisions can become more reactive, driven by immediate concerns rather than long-term strategy. This can further complicate efforts to manage complex global challenges. Historical comparisons once again provide context. Past empires facing similar conditions often experienced overlapping crises, financial strain, external competition, and internal fragmentation, leading to gradual transformation. One important observation made by historians is that these transitions rarely follow a single predictable path. Instead, they develop through a series of interconnected events, each influencing the next. A critical concept in understanding this process is the idea of cumulative pressure. Individually, each challenge may appear manageable. However, when multiple challenges occur simultaneously, their combined effect can accelerate change. For example, rising debt alone may be manageable, and geopolitical tension alone may be manageable. But when both occur together, alongside currency shifts and internal divisions, the overall system experiences significantly greater strain. Experts explain that this is why late-stage transitions can appear sudden, even though the underlying causes have been developing over many years. Another factor being discussed is the role of international perception. Global influence is not determined solely by economic or military strength, but also by how actions are viewed by other nations. Decisions made in one context can shape long-term relationships, affecting alliances, trade partnerships, and diplomatic influence. In recent years, there has been increased focus on how global actors interpret major policy decisions. These interpretations can influence whether countries align, remain neutral, or seek alternative partnerships. Analysts emphasize that perception can become a strategic factor in itself, shaping outcomes beyond immediate policy intentions. At the same time, emerging global blocs and regional partnerships are becoming more visible. Countries are exploring new frameworks for cooperation that reflect changing economic and political realities. These developments are often driven by practical considerations, such as trade efficiency, financial stability, and regional security. While these shifts are still in progress, experts suggest they represent an important part of the broader transition process. As the analysis moves toward its final stage, attention turns to what these combined developments may indicate for the future. The key question is not simply whether change is occurring, but how quickly it is accelerating and what form it may ultimately take. Some analysts believe that the current trajectory points toward a more multipolar global system, where influence is distributed among several major powers rather than concentrated in a single dominant entity. Others emphasize that transitions of this scale are complex and may involve periods of instability before a new balance is established. What remains consistent across all perspectives is the recognition that current developments are interconnected. Economic trends, geopolitical decisions, and domestic conditions are all influencing one another in real time. Understanding these connections, experts argue, is essential for accurately interpreting current events. Rather than viewing each development in isolation, analysts recommend examining the broader pattern, how each factor contributes to an evolving global structure. As this process continues, the coming months and years are expected to provide further clarity on how these dynamics will shape the future global order.